Sometimes we don't get much time to tell our stories. When I was training to be a doctor, I learned with a pediatric emergency physician named Rick Saladino. He used to tell us to present our patients to him by starting with the diagnosis we had made, then giving him enough detail to show him why we were right. In an ER that could see hundreds of kids on a busy Saturday night, it was the best way to keep up. I think of Rick sometimes when I sit at my Passover Seder. When we recount the story of the Exodus, we read a text called the First Fruits Declaration that tries to encapsulate the entire story of Jewish peoplehood, from the ancestors through enslavement to Exodus and freedom in just 4 sentences. 4 lines to cover 400 years. It seems impossible. Yet in the frenetic pace of the emergency department, or in the overworked and underappreciated assembly line of modern primary care, we often ask seriously and chronically ill people to be biblically brief in telling us what's wrong with them. It's a dangerous tactic, and one that leads to the logical error of premature closure. That's thinking that we already know what's going on and discarding other possibilities too early in the story. When that story is one of a genetic disease like Gaucher disease, it has manifestations across many organ systems and potentially deadly or disabling outcomes if not treated, that error can become a tragedy. What medicine misses is the second half of the Haggadah storytelling technique. We recite the lines, but we stop at almost every word to dive deep into its meaning. Afflicted us? How did they afflict us? Strong hand and an outstretched arm? God doesn't have a hand or an arm like we do. What could this be referring to? My guests today are Aviva Rosenberg, CEO and founder of the Gaucher Community Alliance, and our friend Caryn, who has lived her life with Gaucher and was one of the first children to receive a then experimental therapy that has since become a mainstay of treatment. Join us as they talk about how they tell the story of their own journeys with Gaucher and how their lessons can help anyone struggling with illness make their voice heard when it really counts.
No room for the soul that's in my head. No room for the soul that's in my heart.
When someone's sick, they're not just dealing with annoying symptoms. They're confronting some of life's biggest questions. I'm Dr. Jonathan Winkle, and you're listening to Healing People, Not Patients. Join us as we explore how to make our practice about complete healing, healing of the body and the spirit. Aviva, before we launch into the rest of the interview, tell us a little bit about what Gaucher disease is.
So Gaucher disease is a rare genetic disorder which is caused by mutations in the GBA1 gene that leads to deficient enzyme activity. So some of the symptoms of Gaucher disease are very varied, and each patient experiences them differently, but they could include any and all of the above: enlarged liver and spleen, bone pain and fractures, easy bruising and bleeding, anemia, fatigue, growth delays. And then for neuropathic Gaucher, which includes types 2 and 3, these patients additionally have seizures, cognitive impairment, lung, heart, and kidney problems, movement disorders, and death. And finally, for all types of Gaucher disease, there's an increased risk of Parkinson's, osteoporosis, and some cancers. So while it's one mutation for all of us, it causes a whole range of different symptoms, and we all experience them differently.
Okay, so thank you for the description. Tell us how it's treated.
So there's currently 2 types of treatments for the disease that are approved by the FDA. So there's enzyme replacement therapy, which we'll be hearing more about later. That's an infusion, typically every 14 days. And essentially it works by replacing the enzyme that our bodies don't make. The second form of treatment is substrate reduction therapy, or SRT. And this is an oral pill. It's taken once or twice a day, every single day. So both of these forms of treatment are lifetime treatments. So whether you start at age 2 or you start at age 30, once you start, you're on it for life. In addition, and exciting possibility for our community is that we have 2 gene therapy trials that are open and recruiting for type 1 Gaucher disease. So gene therapy obviously is a different form, and there's a lot of hope in the community that this could be something that would happen in the future. But I do want to point out that there's none of these treatments are yet to address the neurological symptoms that come along with Gaucher disease for types 2, 3 in patients. And also when Gaucher patients do sometimes develop Parkinson's later in their life, these current treatments also do not address the Parkinsonian symptoms.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining us this evening. I am welcoming 2 guests tonight. The first is my friend and my neighbor, Aviva Rosenberg. Aviva is the CEO of an organization called the Gaucher Community Alliance, which is an advocacy organization for people with Gaucher's disease, which Aviva will tell us a little bit more about down the line. And I'm also introducing Caryn, who is somebody that Aviva introduced me to at the Gaucher Community Alliance conference held here in sunny Pittsburgh. I swear to you, it was sunny when that conference took place in September 2024. It is not sunny right now, but Caryn is an occupational therapist from the DC area who lives with Gaucher and has some experiences to share with us. And Caryn, actually, I'm specifically bringing you on because when we met at the conference, I was doing a storytelling exercise. I was a couple of months away from bringing out my book, From Illness to Exodus, which is a book about the parallels between chronic illness and the Exodus story from Egypt, where people are stuck in this very narrow place. They don't know when they're going to get out or how they're going to get out. And illness for a lot of people is this constricting, confining place. I want people to tell a story about that place. And using this technique that comes from the Passover Seder, where there's a very short 4-line summary in the Torah of the entire Exodus story from the time that we went down to Egypt to the time we came back up and actually ended up going into the land of Canaan, and all of the enslavement and the Exodus and the wandering through the desert in between. 4 lines. And I said, tell your story in 4 lines, and then we're going to talk about what all of those words that you picked meant. And what you wrote that it just kind of blew me out of the water. And so I wanted to start by asking you to read it.
Okay. Says the mama to the 8-year-old, "You're so special, my love, because you're on the world's very first trial." "That's good, mommy, because living with this is the worst. And I'm often in pain." Says mama to the 18-year-old, "Now you're doing well. Baruch Hashem. Thank God. Go forth and forge your own path in life. College, friends, marriage, whatever. But now it's 25 years later and it still sucks. And I'm still in pain. But it's lonelier now and I have to take care of 7 people. Who takes care of me?"
So that got everybody in the room when you read it to us the first time. One of the reasons that I use this technique is because in my experience, each one of those words can be blossomed into a flower all by itself, blossomed into its own story. Can you tell me a little bit about the word choices? You actually highlighted a couple of things as we were getting ready that you did a little differently this time than there. So talk to me about that.
Well, starting at the beginning, when I'm a child, my story as a child has a lot of pain in it, physical pain. I remember the pain very clearly because even though I have less of it now, the quality is the exact same. And it just brings me back to my childhood when I was having more of it and it was not treated. Words that come to mind, it's the pain that ebbs and flows. It's a very dull pain. It's a pain that when I forget about it, still manages to come back. It's similar to the cold chill that seems to enter your bones when the heater breaks down in the coldest of winter. A gray, smooth pain, a wrapping around pain, a hard to point to pain, especially when the doctor says, "So show me where you've been feeling the bone pain." And that is part of my story. But as a child, I was blessed with, and I'm blessed to have had this beginning with so much love and support and caring for that it almost didn't seem like my problem. It was my problem, but it was also my family's problem. It was something that would be okay. And then there's this transition to independence and young adulthood when I was moving around. In the middle of 12th grade, I did a semester abroad. And then my undergraduate years, I had to figure out how to get my infusions away from home, find my own doctors and make my own logistical plans. And in graduate school in Boston, another set of doctors. So being a young adult brought this transition for focus on the logistics of care for my disease, for Gaucher disease. And that was a focus that took a lot of time and attention in learning how to manage my insurance and take care of the adult aspects of having a chronic illness.
You just said something really very pertinent. I've heard several stories from people that all kind of have that same theme of being chronically ill makes things that other people do without thinking about them require a tremendous amount of thought.
But that transition kept me busy, and it wasn't an emotional transition. This is what it means to have Gaucher disease as a studying abroad student, as an undergraduate, as a graduate student, as a young professional. And then I realized, I think not long before I was enjoying your writing breakout session at the conference, I realized there's another transition I'm undergoing, and that's the emotional transition of dealing with a chronic illness as an adult. And I didn't have time to think of that previously. And I still don't have so much time to think of it with 5 children, but it's sort of creeping up on me that the caretakers in my life are not taking care of my disease anymore. And I still have the pain. Thank goodness, a lot less than I had as a child. But it's lonelier now. I'm having to come to terms with the fact that this is my chronic disease for the rest of my life and take more ownership over the emotional element, actually just face the emotional reality in a way that I didn't have to as a young adult. And so I wanted those transitions in my writing because that's how I've experienced growing into this.
Thank you so much for that. I'm a little sheepish about one of the things that you said because you used that example of the doctor saying, point to where it hurts. And, I mean, I'm a primary care doctor. I must say that 5, 6, 7 times a day. And I learned in my pediatric half of my residency, that's actually a hard thing for small children to do up until about age 7 or 8, is that even when it's not a disease that hurts all over, it's hard for them to localize exactly where pain is. And to think that technique might actually just be, woefully inadequate is really humbling. It reminds me of a doc that I know from Mayo Clinic, a guy named Victor Montori, who wrote a book called Why We Revolt. I mean, he's really a passionate patient advocate for being a doctor. And the website that sprung up around it includes things like a body silhouette that you can actually draw on your pain with colored marker. Illustrate it, which I wonder whether I'm not much of a visual artist, I'm a writer. So I always go to words, but I wonder whether that might not be a better way of approaching this. Which transitions me well into the next question, which is, there's a lot of cynicism about American medicine. And, telling a story like what you just told does not really fit the pace of the way we practice. This close scrutiny, close reading is not something that we think of as there being time for. The cynic would say, like, nobody's got time to ask those kinds of questions, let alone to listen to the answers. So Aviva, as a professional advocate for people with this illness, how do you make sure someone hears a story like what Caryn just told us?
I think stories is all we have because all of our experiences, while each patient is so different, we're all the same in that we share certain themes of the medical community not listening to us, of dismissing various things at some point throughout our lives, whether it's as a child or as an adolescent, as an adult, failure to address parts of our disease or only wanting to address other parts of it. And so without these stories explaining how the quality of life is affected, we cannot live with bloody noses because it affects our ability to take an SAT exam because the blood drips on paper. So I think We have to advocate with stories because in complex, especially rare medical diseases, we don't have another way to show what's going on with our bodies. And so as a patient advocate, part of our organization in our conferences and our webinars, we always incorporate storytelling. We encourage our patients, starting with our youngest patients, to be comfortable in their stories with our team. We have a team group that meets and we do all sorts of role play and improv to get them to just talk to one another and share. And it's kind of a change when the child, the first time they do it, they're whispering, like you can't even hear what they're saying. And then they do it 3 or 4 times. And then it's like, I ask, oh, does anyone want to volunteer? And their hand shoots up in the air. So that's pretty empowering, both for the patient and for the other kids in the room.
For sure. Caryn mentioned in particular the difficulty of getting her pain heard. Literally the last episode of this podcast that I dropped, I had 2 different groups of my students from last semester talking about projects that they had developed that grew out of stories of friends of theirs who had, as adolescents, not been heard either because their parents were in the room, so all the conversation was flowing through them, or because as adolescents, they were not seen as somebody who could possibly have all that much pain lingering after an injury. And so they didn't get the attention that they needed there. Is Caryn's experience widespread in the Gaucher community of people that say, especially as a kid, that they didn't get that attention that they needed?
I would say, unfortunately, it's a typical experience. I think what publications have shown that the 2 things that are most unmet within the type 1 community, so I'm only talking about the type 1, the non-neuropathic community, is fatigue and pain. I think one of the reasons that happens is often our clinical findings, the diagnostic tests, the laboratory markers, those are all showing normal levels. And so when that is happening, it's very easy for a doctor to say, well, the medication, the treatment is working, you're fine. But in reality, so many patients are saying, we're not fine, we're feeling pain, we're feeling fatigue. And so there's a disconnect between what is often reflected in the medical record and what the reality of our daily lives are.
I hear a story that is not just unique to Gaucher, but to so many illnesses that my patients suffer from. But specifically to Gaucher, you've talked with me over the last few months about the need for greater recognition of the disease and the policy and public health arena. For example, like getting Gaucher on the newborn screening panel, which is, of course, state by state. So every single state has to decide on its own to do this. And you said stories are all we have. So what are some of the stories that you used to draw attention to the need, and maybe which ones have been the most compelling?
Yeah, I mean, newborn screening, it's particularly fraught for inequity across the United States. I mean, I think obviously public health itself is very unequitable, and newborn screening is pretty much right at the top of that list. So even in 2026, the average time for diagnosis for type 1 Gaucher disease is 7 years. And for types 3, which is the very severe type, it's 18 months. You have very, very sick babies, infants, newborns that are not getting diagnosed for 18 months. Meanwhile, they're neurologically declining. And this is today in, the country with the best healthcare in the world. But if you were lucky enough to be born in a state where you had newborn screening, you can start treatment at a few weeks old. And so the most compelling stories we have is our families from, let's take Illinois or New Jersey. And this is the most pronounced with our type 3 patient because they can start in Illinois and our newborn screening states. We have a family whose son was diagnosed right at birth. He's got on treatment a few weeks later. He's now in 1st grade and he's met every milestone. There's other families that have, neurological kids born the same time. Some of them are on trachs. Some of them have feeding tubes. Some of them have cochlear implants. This is very, very dramatic. In terms of type 1, I just heard of a 12-year-old girl, type 1. This is a healthy child. She had avascular necrosis in her hip, and they were about to give her a hip replacement at 12 years old. A 12-year-old getting hip replacement. Nobody wanted to know why she had avascular necrosis in her hip. They weren't wondering. They were just about to cut open and solve the problem.
Wow.
So,
They were about to cut open and
solve a problem. And the only reason they didn't go ahead with the surgery was because the blood work before the surgery of course, showed very low platelets. It showed all the other markers of Gaucher. So she had pre-surgical blood work. And they were like, oh, we can't operate because your platelets are too low. That was good. These stories demonstrate why we need newborn screening, because the diagnosis is not happening.
That's a wild story. Wow.
It really is. It reminds me of, I've done some work in the healthcare delivery arena and quality improvement. One of the things that they always tell you to do when you're doing a root cause analysis is ask why 5 times. Why can't you operate? Well, the platelets are low. Why are the platelets low? And that's eventually you drill back far enough and you're like, oh, it's because of this. And then you got your answer. One of the things that I think the stories help with is creating the kind of commonality that connected the three of us in the first place, of knowing that there's these stories. I know on paper that Gaucher is a very common Jewish genetic disease. It's not exclusive to people of Jewish descent, but it is very common in the Jewish community. And I walk in with this idea from the Passover Seder, and I'm starting to explain what that is. And of course, half of the room are people who lead Passover Seders, who are Jewish educators professionally. And then what was most interesting is that for many of the non-Jewish folks in the room, their diagnosis was a way of connecting them to other stories. It brought out, oh, wait, this grandmother, I think, might have been, on this side, might have been Jewish, and connecting them to parts of their history, even as they're dealing with a very serious illness or discovering parts of themselves that they didn't know about before. So that stuck with me.
Gaucher disease can affect anyone, of any ethnicity, any race. It just tends to be more prevalent in the Ashkenazi community. So when you have a patient that's newly diagnosed and they reach out to me and we sit down, we have a conversation, it seems like they're trying to justify why they're not Jewish, or maybe they are. And I have to say, you don't have to be Jewish. Like, it's okay. And this is unique, obviously, to the United States. But in other parts of the world, when you get diagnosed in Pakistan or Japan, you're not wondering if you're Ashkenazi Jewish. But here you are. Patients are always wanting to know, are they Jewish? And I have to say, most, you're not. And that's fine. You're welcome to join us.
But speaking to that common experience, Caryn, you talked about in your first line being 8 years old. I'm really fascinated by this idea, that there are people who need to hear the story before they even realize that it's about them. How did that realization come to you and your family that this is what you were dealing with?
So I was born in South Africa, Johannesburg. My family immigrated to the U.S. when I was 5. I started kindergarten here and lost my accent on the very first day of kindergarten. I was diagnosed when I was 2 years old from a very, very swollen belly. I did not go through what a lot of families have to go through with years and years of delayed diagnosis. I was actually diagnosed rather quickly, but that's unusual. When we were already living here in the Washington area, my family chose to come to the States because of the NIH being in the Washington area. My entire family relocated, largely for a hope that there may be treatment for me in the future.
Nice.
It is amazing. In a very sick place when I was 7 and 8 years old, very lethargic, constant nosebleeds. I couldn't walk up the steps in our home. I had to be carried. I definitely couldn't participate in recess or PE at school. And just at about that time, bringing my story together with all the Jewish elements, we were celebrating Passover in Dallas with my cousins, and I caught strep throat from a cousin. And my body could not handle the infection, even with IV antibiotics. I became septic. And there I was, dying at 8 years old at a hospital in Dallas, far from home. My brother and sister flew back and stay with friends and attend school, but I was stuck in Dallas, very, very sick. And there was no way for me to recover. There was just no plan in place that had any feasible chance. And the NIH was just ready to start their first drug trial in 1988. This was May of 1988. And so the new goal became, we have to stabilize her so that she can fly back to the NIH where my home is in the DC area. That part is a miracle that I was able to be stabilized enough to fly home, but being extremely ill with my platelets wiped out, no immune system left, I did fly back and had my very first infusion at age 8 and was very close to not getting to that point because I was so close to death that the doctors were going to cut me open and take out my spleen. The spleen and liver and bone marrow are the parts that hold on to the disease cells. And they were going to just take out my spleen and liver. Well, my parents knew that I would not be eligible to start the drug trial without a spleen and liver because the trials are to document the effect of the drug on the disease. And my mother found herself a young mother desperate for convincing the doctors to not save my life by cutting me open for emergency life-saving surgery. But she had nothing to argue with. She had no medical degree. And I remember another Jewish element of the story. It was a Friday night. It was Shabbat. And she was trying desperately to get a hold of a family friend back in the Washington area who said, do not cut. She was trying to put the doctors on the phone with this doctor who would convince them to not open me because of the likelihood that the drug trial would start soon and would save my life. And it was Shabbat. So this religiously observant doctor wasn't answering the phone, And so when I hear my mother tell her story of her fear, she was just terrified. This doctor isn't answering my calls from the emergency room. Eventually, this doctor did answer her calls. And this doctor convinced, what are the chances that if you were in the operating room, you would take a phone call from a doctor you'd never met and take direction from her? Well, this operating doctor in Dallas took word from my very close family friend, Dr. Robin Berman, back here in Maryland, and said, okay, if that's what you say, I won't operate. And they were able to stabilize me and send me home. My emaciated, malnourished body with no blood counts left started to slowly recover with infusions at the NIH at age 8.
I think there's so many miracles in that story. I don't know where to start, but one of them, maybe the most miraculous things, is the amount of humility that surgeon showed to say there's something unusual going on here that may be bigger than my single-minded need to cut to save a life. And, I talk a lot about the need for us to be humble and all of my mistakes that have humbled me. And as you did earlier in this interview, I think the ability to recognize when the story isn't following a pattern, right? And you've told stories that are so unique and earth-shaking in a lot of ways that I think maybe that's the thing, right? Like the hip replacement story, recognizing that this isn't normal for a 12-year-old to need a hip replacement. And what got us to this place? Something must have gotten us here that's out of the ordinary. What must it have been? So I think that's a really valuable lesson in any disease.
And just to know that there wasn't a story, there was no drug trial, there was no drug, there was no treatment whatsoever in 1988. They were taking 12 people from around the world, 8 adults, 4 children, and infusing us with something they hoped would work. My parents had no story to follow. It was just guesswork. It was a trial, really a trial. So knowing that I was following an uncharted story is a big part of my story.
Yeah. Basically, like the ancient explorers sailing off the edge of the world, essentially, and hoping that the world was in fact round, which it turned out to be. So this was incredibly worthwhile. I think there's a lot of instruction here for any branch of medicine, whether we're talking about treating a genetic disease or, chronic functional illness like fibromyalgia or mental health, any of the things that I've talked with my other guests about. Your very particular situation turns out to be very universal, which is kind of the message of the Seder, right? This is one people's story that ends up being a universal for all peoples and all individual people. We all go through really tight spaces in our lives and feel like we're never going to get out. And the truth is that sometimes we really do get stuck there, and other times all of a sudden it opens wide. So I'd be really interested to hear if either of you had next steps that you hope that people listening or that I were to take. What would they be? When we get up from this Seder table of ours, we could go out into the world. What should we do?
I think for the Gaucher community, for the patient side, I want to make sure that every patient feels heard, every caregiver feels heard. And especially within the neuropathic community, that's the type 2-3 community. I mean, their caregiver lives, what the caregivers are going through, now, especially in the climate of this country with healthcare costs. And, this is a really hard path to tread. There's no treatment approved for many of the symptoms of neuropathic Gaucher. And so I think, if all they have is their lived experience and their stories, then we have to empower that and we have to use that and harness it to fight for treatment. And I think for the type 1 community, like Caryn and myself, we need to make sure that we're heard and that our medical providers hear us. And if they're not listening, then we need to look for a different provider. And so I think, patients can advocate for themselves. And it's not as simple as saying like, oh, my doctor didn't listen or my doctor doesn't hear me. Well, then we need to find you a better doctor. And we are so lucky in our community. And I think that Caryn can attest to this too, is we have amazing physicians and just super champions. The problem is that not all patients can get to them and not everybody can get to one of these superstar doctors. And if you live in a rural area, you live in an underserved state, or you don't have transportation, then, this isn't right. Everybody should have access to our superstar doctors. And I think for the broader medical community, part of what you said is keep asking questions. Don't just look at the patient and think what's going on. And you would think with all of the algorithms and the electronic medical records that it would just be so simple and it would tell you what the problem is with the patient. But for some reason, it's not working. So you might need to look at the symptoms and type them into ChatGPT yourself because the Epic system is not providing what you need. So that would be my thoughts for the broader community.
And my mission that works parallel to yours is, that there isn't always the better doctor, the other doctor, right? We're in short supply, so we need to be the better doctor. And I think what you've said about listening and asking more questions, that's been my mission for several years. And I'm glad we're walking parallel roads. All right. Thank you both so much for joining me. It took a little bit of a lift to get us all together this evening, but it was truly worth it. And it was even more worth it because none of us had to leave our houses. Those of you who are listening several weeks from now don't realize that this is the day after the massive snowstorm that swept across half the country and has DC and Pittsburgh and pretty much every other city that I've talked to people in today under states of emergency. So it's nice that we're warm and cozy and talking to each other from this distance at this moment. I can't thank you enough for joining me. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I know Aviva and Caryn taught us a lot about Gaucher during the interview, but you may want to learn more. Check out their website at www.gauchercommunity, that's GAUCHER community.org, or their Facebook group at Gaucher Community Alliance, or their Instagram at Gaucher Community Alliance. Whether you're interested in donating for further research or support of families who need it, sharing your story, or finding out more information about the disease, all of these locations can be a great source of information for you. Hope you enjoyed the interview and look forward to having you join my community and theirs. My idea of using this storytelling technique to talk about illness didn't come to me out of thin air. Psychiatrist Arthur Kleinman popularized the idea of illness narratives in medicine almost 40 years ago, referring to the stories patients tell about their experiences of sickness, as opposed to the scientific dismantling of these stories into diagnoses of disease that lose their human element. I was already working on my outline for From Illness to Exodus when I attended the bar mitzvah of a young man named David May. I've known David since he was a toddler. His mother, Molly, taught 2 of my kids how to sing like they mean it. It was a COVID-era bar mitzvah, so David addressed his guests over Zoom, and the commemorative kippot and party favors had to be mailed out across the country a couple weeks in advance. When he began his speech, I realized I was hearing an illness narrative, modeled on the First Fruits Declaration. I'll let him take it from here. My reading today was Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 1 to 13, which is in Parshat Ki Tavo. In this passage, the Israelites are instructed to give the first fruits of their harvest to the priest in a basket as an offering to God. As they made the offering, they said, quote, "My father was a wandering Aramean. He went to Egypt became a nation, and was treated harshly by the Egyptians. Why did they say this? Our ancestors began their ritual of Thanksgiving by remembering the whole story of their journey, beginning with Jacob and Joseph's time in Egypt. They said these words to remind themselves of where they've been, how far they've gotten, and to express gratitude for the entire journey. These same words are part of the Passover Seder. In other words, we remind ourselves of where we have been. We tell the whole story. We celebrate Passover to celebrate our release from slavery and oppression. When we retell the story, we remind ourselves of our oppression. We remind ourselves of that to remember that people who are oppressed today are in a situation we were in, and so we have an obligation to help them. When I'm asked about my hearing aids, I retell the story of my cancer treatment. I was diagnosed with kidney cancer shortly before my first birthday. Radiation and chemotherapy were two of the main treatments used to resolve my cancer, which made it possible for me to grow into young adulthood and be here today. The side effect of one of my cancer medicines was hearing loss. While I don't remember my days of being sick or my time in the hospital, just as the Israelites didn't remember being in Egypt themselves, I do know the story, including the fact that I was in and out of the hospital a lot. I spent most of my toddler years either in the hospital or too compromised to go out. I was diagnosed in June of 2008, and April of 2010 was when my treatment stopped. I can understand what it means to be in the hospital because I've been in a position of those in the hospital. I can only imagine what it's like to be there now when a potentially life-threatening disease is making everything worse. No one can visit, and people can't bring their own comfort objects in. This is why I'm making pillows and blankets for the kids in the hospital. We've also collected donations for Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh. I can now tell the whole story of my cancer, beginning with my own diagnosis, describing my treatments and my hearing loss, remembering and celebrating April 1st as the day I was released from the hospital, and now ending with the giving of these gifts to the children in the hospital. My cancer story is an exact parallel of the story of the Israelites' offering of the first fruits. First, we describe how it started, we talk about the journey, and we celebrate our freedom, and then we offer thanks for where we are now. The storytelling exercise I led for Caryn and others in fall 2024 included sharing David's words and asking them to consider how they would write their own story in just 4 lines. You heard Caryn's response in the interview. But while these stories are compelling and often heartbreaking, they're only a beginning. They require careful questioning, discussion, clarification, finding out what keeps the people telling those stories up late into the night, just like many Passover Seders run well past midnight. You may never find out what the story really means. As Aviva told us a few moments ago, that can have devastating consequences. We need to find a way to get modern medicine around the Seder table, to hear the long version of the story with all the details and explanations. I've spent more than a quarter century in medicine since I entered medical school in 1999, trying to find a way to do that, even a little better, each time. One thing I've learned is to ask good questions and let people answer them, for real. But as the Haggadah teaches, there are those who don't know how to ask. In those cases, say the sages, you open for him. Don't wait for the question. Inspire it with a story. Find your 4 lines. Look that person in the eye and say what needs to be said. And if you don't know what to say, try this approach. Line 1. This is what I'm feeling. Number 2. This is what I think is wrong. Number 3. This is what I'm most worried about. And number 4. This is what I hope someone will do for me. In honor of Aviva and Caryn, David, Molly, and the rest of the May family, and everyone who's on an illness journey, I wish you the courage and the clarity to tell your story, and the blessing of finding caring people who will listen to it and write a fitting next chapter with you. Thanks for spending time with me today. If this conversation sparked something in you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and share it with a colleague who could use a reminder of why we do this work. For more thoughts, explore my blog at www.healerswholisten.com/blog, or follow me on Instagram at healerswholisten. For deeper dives, check out the book version of Healing People, Not Patients, or my second book, From Illness to Exodus. Links to both are in the show notes. Our theme song, Room for the Soul, is available on Bandcamp. It's a reminder that together, we can find room for the soul in medicine. This podcast is not medical advice, nor is it legal or financial counsel. It's a space for reflection, rooted in stories, spirituality, and the art of healing. For your own care, always consult the professionals who know you best.